This lecture performance is entitled Language Systems and Fleshy Machines and Aparralel Becoming. Recently, I was in conversation with Matt Morris, who's a part of our bi-weekly visits, and he brought up a conversation he had with his neighbor, whom he was only loosely acquainted. This happenstance engagement with his neighbor led Matt to articulate something he'd been working through for quite some time, and which had merit in the conversations we've been having over the past few months. What Matt told his neighbor was, paraphrased and simplified of course, identity is a failed system. The statement on its own requires a bit of extrapolation, as that Matt then went on to say that identity, as something which was created by hegemonic structures, does exactly what it was meant to do. Both statements can and do coincide. This paradoxical situation can itself exist because of the way identity is constructed by the systems which create it, and the people who are identified by it. The hegemonic systems project of identification works exactly as intended, dividing and relegating people to specific groups, while simultaneously assimilating difference. Identity creates a situation in which one identifies more with a given, and more often than not, simplified identity position, than with the actual material experiences in which they participate. A master's tools master how situation arises, in which working from within identity, while not impossible, becomes incredibly bogged down and problematized by the systems set in place to define those identities. Identity requires identification, and requires generalizations in order to allow the identification to work. Generalizations have a habit of creating faulty and non-inclusive spaces. If one does not look like or abide by certain structures of an identity, they no longer exist in that identity position. I think of the cruel statements leveled at people in my grade schools that they were the whitest black kid I know, or not even really that Mexican, you speak so white. Even recently, my friend Braxton's blackness was questioned because of the way he dressed, spoke, and the fact that he played rock music, which is in and of itself a contradiction in terms, as if rock and roll, which came from a large mixture of the music of the early 20th century, such as gospel, jazz, rhythm, blues, and country, is not built upon the innovations of majority black musicians. This again is a paradox, however, for in an attempt to defend the blackness of my friend, I reify some black identity that I am not even a part of, simply because of another's rigid idea of what black is. Not to mention, my friend's identity is not a case study to be followed through, but rather a fluid network of influences and friendships and loves that elucidates his sense of self, but is still in that way ever-changing. This is not simply relegated to race, and we see this operate just as often in other identity positions. I begin with race to provide as an example the ways in which it is easy to fall into using simplified identity politics. I also think of when I was younger and children would make fun of me and call me a girl simply because my parents let me grow my hair out. Even at a young age, children were taught to police other children's perceived gender crimes. This is further reiterated in the fact that young me understood why being called a girl could be perceived as an insult. The second half of the title of the essay from which I'm reading gets its name from a comment made by current director of the Office for Civil Rights at the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, Roger Severino, when he was the head of the DeVos Center for Religion and Civil Society at the Heritage Foundation. This quote, which was referenced in a recent New York Times article, and comes from an article Severino published at the Daily Signal in 2016, discussing the Obama administration's expansion of the definition of sex, in which Severino writes, "The administration's moves, soon in North Carolina, have prompted a massive backlash from people who are justifiably concerned about their safety, privacy, and religious freedom, and who refuse to accept a federal government driven by such a radical gender ideology." He argues that this attempt to impose a new definition of what it means to be a man or a woman in the entire nation. Severino latches onto the distinction between sex and gender for his own aims, arguing that Congress, when protecting people from discrimination on the basis of their sex, did not state this with the intention that it would retroactively include gender identity, even if the Obama administration interpreted it in this way. Laws can be interpreted either as they were originally intended or on a case-by-case basis as the contemporary situation in which they are being read changes. We see this problem reflected in the current debate surrounding the interpretation of the Second Amendment adopted in 1791 as a part of the Bill of Rights, which is read to the letter by the right while arguing that they are actually understanding the spirit of the law. The left chooses to take the progression of time and weaponry into account in their interpretation of the law. Severino is arguing that a law must be read to the letter until it is actively changed, and that what it says is what it says. In other words, we must take the original intent as law, not an interpretation of it. This can move into loose and dangerous territory, considering that society does in fact change over time, and we should be wary of relying on outdated forms of knowledge to structure how we understand the world now. Science is always structured by authoritative and structural biases. Phrenology, a practice in which the shape of a person's skull was an indicator of their personality and even propensity for crime, is a perfect example of a science influenced by a racist society. One can even see this as far back as Galileo's refutation of a geocentric model in favor of a heliocentric one, where everything revolves around the sun, which he was required to refute by the Pope or be charged with heresy. What the dominant ideologies of a time are and how they seep into governmental and scientific structures are always of concern to those who insist on the society's systems of thought and power. The Trump administration's rollbacks on Obama-era protections of the transgender community reflects this ability for a society's views to structure government, especially when it comes to views of people which are embedded within the fabric of a society. However, there is no systemic difference between the inspiration behind the actions of the Trump and Obama administrations. While there is a definitive material effect on the transgender community when protections are rolled back, both the Trump and Obama administration's views of change occur through authority, specifically governmental authority. Even though recognition and visibility of transgender individuals increased in the time of Obama's presidency, the recorded and recognized deaths increased in that time as well. The causes of this increase could be interpreted in two different ways. One, that we simply had a better record of the deaths that were already occurring after recognition and visibility was conferred to the community. Two, which is much more grim, is the idea that because of this greater recognition and visibility, there was a violent backlash against the community. Changing systems of government is not the same as changing people's minds about whether or not a person deserves to be seen as someone deserving of life. When my friend Carrie came out in high school, they had a material effect on a friend of theirs who changed her stance on gay marriage because of their relationship with her. Statistics back this isolated situation up, for example. Knowing someone who is gay makes an individual more likely to support gay marriage. Yet, taking even this into account, we still have a huge problem. If both Obama and Trump's administration's main ways of affecting change in terms of who deserves to have their civil rights protected by the government is through strictly legislation, then a push and pull will continue within how the government at any given time chooses to interpret laws, and in turn what kinds of structural change occurs. This is currently happening in the administration's Department of Health and Human Services, who have been privately arguing that the term sex was never meant to include gender identity or even homosexuality, and that the lack of clarity allowed the Obama administration to wrongfully extend civil rights protections to people who should not have them. This effort has been spearheaded by none other than Roger Severino, who is currently the director of HHS's Office for Civil Rights. And sure, if you really in your heart believe that transgender people don't exist, then that statement makes some sort of sense. That's the problem, though. Governmental authority is fickle and can change hands during any election. And we've seen through the rise of the Trump administration that divisive scare tactics can mobilize a base. What has to occur cannot occur through legislation alone, but it also cannot occur through simply making sure people have a transgender friend. It's actually much closer to something Roger Severino said, which is changing the ways in which this country understands what a man or a woman is. Taken a bit more broadly, and in relation to what we originally started with when talking about Matt's position on identity, it requires a restructuring of how we understand identity and how we use identity to confer or take away the subjecthood and humanity of a person. Before we go any further, just as Jose Estranino states at the beginning of his book, Disidentification, Grades of Color in the Performance of Politics, when he says, disidentification is not always an adequate strategy of resistance or survival for all minority subjects. I must state the limits of my own strategy. Some of the limits have been stated already, but deserve a bit of extrapolation. As we live in a state founded on democratic principles of representation, it is important that the possibility for change is not ignored. Minority groups can still benefit from and sometimes require protections by the law, which can still affect change, as can be seen in the recent sentencing of the Chicago police officer Jason Van Dyke for the murder of Laquan McDonald, a black 17-year-old, itself unfortunately an isolated incident. The sentencing. Visibility and representation, while not always ideal situations for seeing oneself, do have clear results in helping, especially young children, see themselves reflected back. It can also affect how white students on predominantly white college campuses see minority groups, especially after a lifetime of being exposed to primarily stereotypes and misinformation. Yet, I will continue because while it is important that laws and minds are changed and we see progressive moves in how people are treated in the eyes of the law and their peers, we must address the problem of identity as a whole, and why the anything but simple conferring of subjecthood is not always the cut and dry answer we would like to believe it is. A second and quite important point that my friend Alex stated in one of our recent conversations that I hope would be evident, but I think is an important conceptual context to always keep in mind, is that we are talking about human beings. This term will be complicated later, but for now let's go with it. Even as I discuss my friends and others to make points and support arguments, I have attempted in my language to prevent them from falling into cliches and case studies. However, when one is operating solely in language on the page, or even spoken language, people can easily become talking points, no matter how much you work against it. One must always work to humanize. This important note came after me and Alex We're discussing a recent photograph of Aid Abu Amro, a Palestinian protester taken by Mustafa Hassouna, that looks like the painting Liberty Leading the People by Eugene Delacroix from 1830. We were amazed by the beauty of the photograph and the power behind having an image of a Palestinian protester photographed and disseminated in this way, but did so while remembering that he was, and still is, in mortal danger. Since editing this, on November 8, 2018, he was shot by Israel in the leg, but is in stable condition. How can we recognize the symbolic importance of an image and square that with the human that exists behind that symbol? I think we are capable of doing it. And it's as simple as reminding oneself every time, if I didn't believe that we had the innate capability to humanize others, I would not be able to do what I do. Two, train of thought, non sequitur towards an end goal, turning it into a sequitur. It does not follow. Word does follow flesh. Flesh allows oneself to exist in the world. Once flesh is one with the world flesh, word descends upon the world, creating interference between perception and reality. And interference is a fact of the language system that guides us through a world always presupposed by language. Our flesh can operate in ways to close that gap created by language, but once it must be communicated, language creeps its way back into perception. Our fleshy machines keep us moving through a perceivable world. As word inscribes itself on flesh, the flesh continues to work itself under the word, warping the word as the word displaces itself on flesh. The word guides, but it is manipulable. It is manipulated as it slides onto and around flesh. 3. November 20th, 1923, Postulates of Linguistics. From here, I will invoke a retelling of Gilles Deleuze and Felix Guattari's plateau, November 20th, 1923, Postulates of Linguistics. This retelling will take a few different forms, different for each section. There will be no footnotes referencing where in the text that I am speaking to, as I will be generally following the arguments of the text in chronological order. This retelling will also constitute an encounter with the text, of which Deleuze in Dialogues 2, written with Claire Carnet, speaks of when he says, "To encounter is to find, to capture, to steal, but there is no method for finding other than a long preparation. Stealing is the opposite of plagiarizing, copying, imitating, or doing like. Capture is always a double capture, theft a double theft. And it is that which creates not something mutual, but an asymmetrical block, an aparralel evolution, nuptials, always outside and between." He then calls this a conversation, which he follows with an example of the encounter, which is a Bob Dylan poem. So what will transpire after this is a conversation between myself and Deleuze and Guattari, spoken through my written voice, interspersed with their voices. This retelling of the plateau, however, should not be taken as a definitive guide to the plateau itself. There are moments of collapse, moments where to synthesize the meanings of the text cause them to become flimsy and fall apart. One must find within this text the in-betweens that occur, the meaning behind the meaning. This retelling constitutes a use of the conceptual tools introduced by Deleuze and Guattari, and in many ways is more a pragmatics of postulates of linguistics than a concretizing of their meanings. If you do not find what you need, throw it away. Language is informational and communicational. What I am telling you and the language I am using to tell it to you is structured by a giving of orders, redundancy. Through a retelling of postulates of linguistics, I am in many ways simply relaying information given to me. However, this is no different than a normal dispersal of information communicated through language. Basic language is the order word, which means that language when used is meant to be obeyed. Language in the case is not a tool. It does not refer to anything prior and only requires that you know just enough of the command of language to flow through the word. Every order word carries a little death sentence. There is also nothing behind language that one can find that it departs from, for it always goes from saying to saying and is not based on communication. In this case, indirect discourse is that which defines the first determination of language. This is why bees cannot be said to have language, for they can only communicate what they have seen, not what another bee has seen. Language, however, is not content to go from a first party to a second party, but necessarily goes from a second party to a third party. This leads us to understand that language always comes from those who have not seen. It is in this sense that language is the transmission of the word as order word, not the communication of a sign as information. If all of language is a command, but that is supposedly a specific type of statement, then how do we reconcile this paradox? J.L. Austin theorizes that language has the ability to make effects happen. He describes the two ways language can do this in the performative I swear and the elocutionary I love you, and are termed implicit or non-discursive presuppositions. This has led to three important and immediate consequences. 1, it has made it impossible to conceive of language as a code, also made it impossible to conceive of speech as the communication of information. 2, semantics, syntactics, and or even phonematics cannot be defined without an engagement with pragmatics. Instead, pragmatics becomes the presupposition behind all the other dimensions and insinuates itself into everything. 3. It makes it impossible to maintain the distinction between language and speech. The meaning and syntax of language can no longer be defined independently of the speech acts they presuppose. This being the most important point of all, these implicit presuppositions of which performative is a subset of the elocutionary prevents us from understanding language and speech as anything but speech acts. Emile Benveniste would argue that the performative does not relate to acts, but to self-referentiality of terms. This means that subject or intersubjectivity exists within language as opposed to presupposing speech acts. It is subjective communication any better than an informational communication. Oswald Ducourt reverses this and says that the performative rather accounts for self-referentiality. The performative itself is explained by the elocutionary. The elocutionary then depends on collective assemblages of enunciation, judicial acts, or their equivalents. These determine subjectification proceedings, and this means that language is then what constitutes the subject or its death sentence or its command. Order words are not simply contained within the schema, rather they relation of every word or every statement to implicit presuppositions, those speech acts which are only accomplished in an utterance. Order words do not concern commands only, but every act that is linked to statements by a social obligation. We can then only define language as a set of all order words, implicit presuppositions, or speech acts that are current within it. This then means that language is not the communication of information, but a transmission of order words. The relation of the statement and the act in this case then is one of redundancy, in which it is not the statements and its acts that matter, but that it has been done before and some kind of precedent. This enunciation has no subject, but rather it's a social act. One based entirely in a society. We live in a society. What I mean by this enunciation is a collective assemblage of enunciation. Through this collective assemblage, we can see subjectification and individuation as occurring only insofar as this collective requires it for transmission. Indirect discourse accounts for this. The statements become individuated and enunciations become subjectified only insofar as they have already been said by a second party to a third party. The language is in a language, the order words in a word. However, this is not simply redundancy, but rather constitutes incorporeal transformations which are attributed to bodies in a broad sense. One thinks that the person's body is transformed into exact conduct as the utterance of the judge's verdict, or that of a designation of age. You are no longer a child. The incorporeal transformation is instantaneous and the order words are assemblages. It is not about eluding an order word, but rather escaping the death sentence. One need not move away from language in order to make it your own. It's about understanding the variations of language which make it less rigid and more prone to lines of flight to its edges and beyond. Only continuous variation can bring life into the language, so that it does not become a linguistics without a pragmatics, the essential element of the real beneath the everyday. One should bring forth the order word of the order word, and the order word life must answer the answer of death, not by fleeing, but by making flight act and create. There are passwords beneath order words, words that pass, words that are components of passage, whereas order words mark stoppages or organized stratified compositions. A single thing or word undoubtedly has this twofold nature. It is necessary to extract one from the other, to transform the compositions of order into components of passage. Politics works language thoroughly from within. The incorporeal transformation has at its heart the order word, the word that connects speech and acts by being redundant with them. The order word is the word or phrase that arranges social bodies and demands obedience. It is the fundamental unit of the statement, connecting it to implicit presuppositions, collective assemblages of enunciation, and machinic assemblages of bodies. I is an order word. It imposes a discipline and a different discipline in each position and in each configuration in which it is uttered. The concept of the order word ruins the old structuralist dualism of the subject of the statement and the subject of the enunciation, since the order word simultaneously demands subjectification and accomplishes it through incorporeal transformation. Each time I say I, it does not mean the same thing as the time before or the time to come. It is in a different configuration of power relations, a different encounter of forces. Can the word I, then, whenever it is uttered, be said to be the same word, even grammatically or phonologically? Politics works language thoroughly from within. Therese Grisham, linguistics isn't a discipline, losing guitar is pragmatics. What is the point of a retelling of Deleuze and Guittar's postulates in linguistics? Why would something which causes the source to become flimsy and fall apart and lead to confusion and frustration be necessary in understanding postulates in linguistics, let alone be useful to any kind of political conversation? First, it must be stated that challenges to political discourse do not occur in the following of order words, nor in the formulation of questions from answers already given, for those are just answers to be answered. Meaningful discourse and meaningful ways of moving through the world come from the creation of one's own questions. And I say meaningful literally. full of meaning. Questions are invented like anything else. If you aren't allowed to invent your own questions with elements from all over the place, or never mind where, if people pose them to you, you haven't much to say. Deleuze here states that one must formulate a question with all that you have and not simply take these questions from people as if that is what you have to answer. Take, for example, the math equation. If you are always told 2 + 2 = 4 and you never do the math yourself, then you have simply inherited knowledge. You will think the only way to do math is putting things together. But if you were allowed to think past the equation given to you, then you could get to a point where you understand mathematics in the abstract and can devise multiplication. In this case, you have escaped the confines of simple addition and can expand your knowledge beyond it. This example, of course, was followed through thousands of years ago by the Babylonians. New questions are not simple to come by, but are always rewarding when found, and more often than not cannot be found in conventional forms of authority. Deleuze and Guattari were hesitant of authority. They did not feel that authority or even individual identity was a good state to exist in. Guattari's sense of a distrust of individuality came from his early days in the French communist groups, which he saw imitating Stalinist hierarchies, as well as the sense that a stronger sense of the individual was impeding the treatment of psychosis. Deleuze's came from his idea that thought came not from one's own identity, but was generated through difference, and that the individual only occurs under conditions of difference. They were, of course, then spurred by the events of May 1968, and soon after, were to meet together and start their friendship, as well as their working life together. I state this, even as it disrupts my point, only to contextualize a specific moment of philosophy, which happens to manifest in Deleuze and Guattari. It is entirely against looking at their work through their specific lens of subjectivity. That is to say, it is important to understand why others do what they do, but why another did what they did is not sufficient a reason to follow their logic. Sometimes the reason they do what they do can be reason enough to dismiss it. This is the reason for a retelling. Even though things fall apart and become flimsy, other things rise to the fore. It forces a response to a reading, an investigation of the reading, instead of an absorption. Easy readings are always deceptively truthful, insofar as they are absorbed and not critically read. It is not that easy readings are themselves treacherous, but they present themselves as things which are in and of themselves better than something dense. They are just as susceptible to untruths and problematic moments and must be read as such. By retelling Deleuze and Guattari, the whole problem shifts. Just like when a painting sits in proximity to another, the relationship they exist within produces a third painting in between. We have a third essay in between postulates of linguistics. That essay is necessarily created by the reader and does not allow itself to be closed down by the reading, but is empowered through it. This allows for what normally would be a set of order words, providing tiny death sentences with every line to allow for lines of flight in every direction, in and out, up and down, through and beyond, with no prescriptive meanings and only a new way of approaching a language which itself always lays out a path within itself, if you are not careful. However, there are always options within that language to diverge from a path seemingly set out and move away from it. In her essay, Linguistics as an Indiscipline, Deleuze and Guattari's Pragmatics, quoted at the beginning of this section, Therese Grisham argues for the possibility of Deleuze and Guattari's restructuring of linguistics as something which has political potentiality. She states in the essay that the reader of postulates of linguistics encounters several difficulties. Binary oppositions turn out to be produced by non-binary socio-political processes. Dualisms collapse. Concepts vanish when they are no longer useful, appearing again in altered form somewhere else. Grisham acknowledges some of the problematics of Deleuze and Guattari's approaches in the depiction of women in their theory, and acknowledges why it would be that feminist linguistics would ignore the work of Deleuze and Guattari, itself an act Deleuze and Guattari would have supported, in her statement that women have never had a subjectivity to lose. Grisham follows this with her own acknowledgement that we cannot ignore that subjectivity necessarily means subjectification, so one can form a theory of agency, and that many feminist theories of agency and subjectivity have themselves been used in the service of keeping others in their place. Grisham finds in Deleuze and Guattari's reevaluation of linguistics something useful in its challenging but totalizing theory of subjectivity, which would itself reproduce substandards for others who are inevitably not included in the problematically overarching definition. Deleuze and Guattari's Pragmatics become the key to a feminist program which challenges the limits of categories such as gender, which is itself a limitative, incorporeal transformation, but has within it moments of flight and fling which are themselves useful for a feminist linguistics. Since Pragmatics offers a broad political base for the analysis of language in terms of the combined functions of the state and their relations to collective assemblages of enunciation, machinic assemblages of bodies, and D and reterritorialization, it also offers precise and complex ways to analyze written or spoken utterances to any feminist willing to take them up and adapt them. If we were to return to the problem set up at the beginning of this essay, that the government wishes to define transgender out of existence, as well as the argument brought with it that identity is a failed system. We find a reason why this can occur at all set out in Deleuze-Guattari's and Grisham's evaluations of linguistics. Language itself has the power to subjectify, so it makes sense then that the removal of rights of groups of people come in how we define and speak about them, as well as how we act towards them. The solution then cannot come in and appeal to the hearts of those in government to reevaluate the positions on transgender individuals. One solution could be to restructure the entirety of our relationship to identity categories set out by these hegemonic structures, which wish to assimilate difference into simplistic categories which can only operate in punishing those who overstep boundaries accepted by the categories. We return to the material of language in speech and in writing to learn how to create our own spaces of utterance that seek to both affirm and challenge themselves, not antithetical concepts, each other and our engagement with others. This refusal of simplistic identity is not concerned with defining anything out of existence, but rather reorienting the very ways we engage with others and define ourselves, all while refusing simplicity in favor of acknowledging the complexities of difference within each body that you meet. The flesh, structured by the word in the sense, does not become something which operates outside of a world, but rather lives directly in it and is always affected by others around it. 5. Politics is something you do with your body. This whole thing has been written in very many different places while simultaneously printing it on a risograph machine in sections so as to have it done for deadlines. This has affected in many ways the form of the book as well as the way in which I have written things. Currently, I am writing this while listening to Gordon Power say at their lecture performance, "Read me that part again where I disinherit everybody," which is the inspiration of this section. At the beginning of the lecture performance, they discussed Maurice Merleau-Ponty's The Intertwining the Chiasm, which had a deep effect on them. Through the discovery of this essay through Hall's lecture performance, I myself have become deeply affected by this essay. Merleau-Ponty's idea of the flesh has been deeply important to this essay, book, theory, presentation, lecture performance, all of which this will be, and has helped me to understand the ways in which word and flesh coincide and intermingle as the base of what constitutes us. Or as Hall explains it in their lecture performance. The essay, its impenetrability partly explained by the fact that Merleau-Ponty died suddenly while still editing it, outlines his notion of the flesh, which is, in his formulation, an elemental principle that describes the intertwining of the material and immaterial attributes of both the human body and objects in the world. We know the world because we are of it, thing ideas like the objects around us. If we are to move forward from the simple and complex statement that identity is a failed system, then we must have some kind of hopeful declaration that allows us to move from that. For me, I find it in what Gordon said to their undergrad students. Politics is something you do with your body. Itself also a simple and complex statement. This is not to say that you can only do politics if you have complete control of your body, unburdened by structural oppression, chronic illness, disabilities of movement, mental illness, and so on and so on. In fact, those states of being, because of the state of our world, are themselves political states of being. Especially when one fights for their right to live, even as the world tells them otherwise. This is not to glorify structural oppression, or chronic illness, or disability, but rather is an acknowledgement of the ways in which politics proliferates and is itself moving through everything. Hall's declaration problematizes the idea that politics only occurs in the big abstract, in Congress, in voting booths, in debate halls. Here we have a politics that exists within the world and within our bodies, which are themselves of the world. We cannot escape politics, but more importantly, politics cannot escape us. At the end of their talk, Gordon states, "I now gather that for Merleau-Ponty, thought is not prior to language, and language cannot be understood as expressive of thought. For him, we are expressive, fundamentally. The articulation of the idea is the idea itself. Speech and thought are," he used the word intervolved. Spoken language is, for Merleau-Ponty, an extension of gesture. It is as bodies that we know the world, that we express ourselves, and that we listen to each other. Even written texts are forms of corporeality. In reading or listening, we take up the orientation of the speaker. Speech in the speaker does not translate ready-made thought, but accomplishes it. Speech accomplishes thought. This aligns quite nicely with the Deleuzian space we were operating in earlier, but also gets at the last idea I wish to bring up, one that I've been drinking through in my own practice as of late. The body is bibliography. So the idea that we are ourselves the sum of all of our references, experiences, loved ones, friends, acquaintances, traumas, and thoughts. This list is in no way a fully comprehensive explanation of the things which affect us, but gets at the large amount of influences that we have on us in the world. It is another way of describing what I meant when I referred to the self as a concept earlier. Body as bibliography is what gives the self legs to stand on. I also skipped a whole section. As a concept, it is relatively straightforward, but I think the implications are vast. It may, borrowing from Merleau-Ponty, be better to say the flesh is a bibliography. The world inscribes on our flesh, and this act of inscribing is the incorporeal transformation. It is of the flesh while also acting on the flesh. also allows us to understand that this is not simply a self-made bibliography. It is much the culture you were born into, as well as the clothes you choose to wear, that manipulates this bibliography. Of course, you can work against and shift the things that are contained within this bibliography. Just because you are born into a racist society does not mean you yourself have to be racist. Yet it is still important to acknowledge the ways in which that racism seeps into you and thoroughly works you from within, and that it takes effort to work against ingrained racism. Another example would be that of trauma. It is not easy to work against childhood trauma, however one can manage it to work, but it is not something so easily placed to the side. The end of this is approaching, even as I have introduced a new concept, but I believe that Fleshy's bibliography is easily worked into that which came before it chronologically in this essay. It is not so neatly fleshed out as it might appear at first glance. To continue to explain this concept would become a process of reiteration and prescription. So I will leave you with this idea planted in your bibliography in hopes that it will continue to grow out of my control and out of the written word on the page. It is a concept to be acted upon, to be understood, and to be lived in life. I leave you with this idea, which is one I think the losing guitar in their own esoteric ways wanted to instill, and one which Gordon has uttered in one way or another, and especially to their undergrad students, as the phrase, "Politics is something you do with your body," which I still cannot get out of my own head. In order to truly engage with concepts, no matter how straightforward, how theoretical, how conceptual, how poetic, they must be lived. Books are important, ideas are important, but we live in the flesh and we die in the flesh. Please, if you take nothing else from this essay, book, theory, presentation, lecture, performance, however you in this moment are experiencing it, it is important that you act on it or don't, but do it with purpose. While I am in danger of sounding sentimental, I believe these things to be true, and I hope that funnels out of myself in some way. Thank you. Thank you all for coming.
I was really waiting for you to smash one of those boulders.
I don't know if I can.
Well, I know, I was curious too, but I felt like there was so much tension throughout the performance, you know, and like these moments where you're talking really fast and then you can't breathe and then it's heavy and then you're balancing. And I mean, I don't know even if I'm recommending that you should try that, but I did have this sort of constant like waiting for that thing that, if that could be the flesh in a way, like that external object thing that symbolizes and is physically a kind of burden. So I was like thinking about it in that way. Just what would happen? Yeah, I know, you know.
It is just solid clay, so.
Or even just if it thudded, you know, like I just really wanted to know what happened.
I mean, I could do it.
That's just a response, I guess. Not necessarily a recommendation, but a response.
Can I add in? Can I take some of this from you?
Yeah.
It's like your burden.
I mean, you can take one of the 30-pound ones.
They've asked us to actually, I'm just going to do that instead of saying anything. I'm going to carry it over here. Okay.
They're really fun to engage with. Like, that's the funny thing too, is they operate in this like very like heavy physical way, but like the whole time, because like to make them, I wedged clay that was over grog so that it could stay solid in the firing process. And so like I've spent so much time with these, and like there are moments where you can see like my hand and where my hand like made them what they are. So I have like this nice connection to them, and even though they like are this like 200-pound extension of my performance, it's like ends up being very comforting. Like whenever I'm doing this during the presentation, it's probably because I'm nervous, and like this is the nicest thing to do, is just while reading, have this like just resting on my head, like those weighted blankets.
Anxiety vest.
Yeah, anxiety rocks.
Could you speak again about what you mean, or like you expanding this term of like flesh? Because there's this essay that I was reading by Hortense Spillers, and she talks about the distinction between body and flesh.
What essay is it?
Mama's baby, Papa's maybe. Yeah.
No one just told me to read that.
Yeah,
Yeah,
it's
I'm,
great.
I think it's, cause she's referring to Maris Merleau-Ponty's The Flesh, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, so the flesh, the best way I can put it is, so he's talking about, like he starts off with vision, and it's like the seer and the seen. So like, and he kind of complicates that as like, in order to see, we must also be seen. Then he moves into touch, and like to be able to touch, we must also be a part of the world that can be touched. And so he's kind of referring to it as like an element of being. So like this kind of thing that underscores everything, essentially saying that we are invariably kind of connected within the world. So like when I referenced that the lecture performance by Gordon, when they say we are thing ideas, like the objects around us, like we are kind of fully encompassed. Like I haven't read that essay yet, so I don't know exactly how she's using it or extrapolating on it, or kind of like maybe complicating what Ponty put forward. But it's like, it's kind of like that. It's like the fact that like me right now, like this is all kind of like within it. Like we are all kind of connected in that, like, not in like the kind of like spiritual way where it's like we're all connected, but like we are necessarily part of this like world, and everything is kind of within it. It's like it opposes a lot of like a Cartesian mind-body dualism, you know, which I think is a good way to think about it. So,
We can talk after.
yeah, we can.
Like the extended mind theory, that there's this interconnection. Is that what you're talking about?
Kind of. I mean, Merleau-Ponty is coming from like a very phenomenological standpoint. So like the joke of phenomenology is that when a phenomenologist looks at like, can't ever remember which is the front and the back of the hand, but like when they look at the front of their hand, they're like, okay, now I know the front of my hand exists. But when I look at the back of my hand to confirm that it exists, I no longer can see the front of my hand, so does that exist anymore? Which is a dumbed down, stupid version, but I always find it funny and helpful. It's like the idea that like we understand the world through existing in it and through experiencing it, and that is because through Merleau-Ponty's idea of the flesh, like, you know, we are very much so like, you know, when I touch this, there's like necessarily this kind of touching back, or like that kind of question of like, when I touch my hand touching, you know, at what, like, am I being the touched or am I touching? Or like if somebody else were to be touching my hand as it's touching this, like like there is no like primary toucher or primary, you know, being touched, like it's kind of always in that moment.
But it also brings up that difference between like being seen versus being felt, or being known, and the knowledge being implicit rather because it's been identified or because it's been embodied. So like there's, you know, and like you don't know, you can't see it, so maybe you don't know it's there, but you know it's there because you feel it.
Exactly, yeah. I think it's kind of like a, what is it, like proprioception? Like the fact that our bodies can sense in that way. Yeah. It's like the way, one of the examples he uses is, I forget what context he's using it. I think this is when he's just talking about scene, but he talks about the scene, the strand that is seen at the seashore. Like there are these two bodies, the sand and the water, that are constantly intermingling and mixing with one another and engaging with one another, but there is a certain separateness, but you can't find that. You can't find that moment where they separate, because they don't.
I'm passing your burden around.
Oh yeah, that's one of the heavier ones. Yeah.
Can you talk about, and again, not because I think it was the wrong choice, but I want to ask about the choice to do something as opposed to something else. So the choice to read as opposed to speak this essay, I mean, despite the fact that it's very long,
Oh,
like,
yeah.
was that a really was it really important that you are reading in this performance as opposed to speaking?
Yeah, I mean, I've been thinking about that a lot because, like, I'm limited by my ability to memorize, which is not at all, but I still have to obviously consider it. And, like, what I like about having the reading is that in that way it kind of operates within the writing and, what's it called, and, like, my voice, and it also gives me that opportunity to kind of, like, for example, during that news part, like, I have that ability to just throw away a portion of it, but, like, not just, like, but, like, you see it happen, as opposed to, like, if it's memorized, I can just omit things as necessary or omit things because I forget, and it kind of is, like, that nice way of, like, you know, there's this kind of coming from, and there's the first time I did this, I gave, this is a different way I did it this time where I had, like, a projection of the words. There was another time where I gave out, like, little, like, giveaways of the essay that were Rezo printed, so that you could follow along with me in the written word. And then you would have the essay to take away with you. And because it's Rezo printed then too, there's that tactile element that occurs where the Rezo never dries. So the more you're handling it during my performance, the more the red ink gets on your hands. So, like, there's these, like, yeah, like, different ways. I mean, I'm trying to do different variations. Maybe one day I could figure out a way to memorize this, and I think that would be interesting. But I think also too, then that kind of moves it into the realm of theater a little bit more. Also, something that is, like, acted out instead of something that is kind of, like, at least, like, lodged down by being in my hands.
Also, I mean, you're interacting with an image plane by looking at that, and then there's a refutation of that. So there's this weird thing that goes on within the rhythm. Just a comment.
I thought your reading, it was so much text, and with your performance, I thought, for me, the reading was really special because when you think of all the subjects like race and gender, it's just so much bureaucracy, so much, words around it, and so much, what does the Obama administration say, what does the Trump, it just weighs you down, and after a while you hear all this stuff, and it's just words bouncing at you, but it's like you just become numb to all these issues that are personal to you. So having you read it and being able to see it, that's how I felt. I felt as a Black person, all of these rules, all these laws, it's just so much, it's just burdensome and heavy on you. And that's how I took it with your performance.
Yeah, Terry, I agree. And I mean, I also really was interested when your voice started to break, like when you were laying on the ground and your voice started to break because you were like running out of air, you were struggling to get the words out, and that then if I'm reading, like that relationship of me feeling like how you're struggling to get through it, like you're almost spitting out the words, and it was that kind of, there was a beautiful moment where you actually you were talking about the objectness of words and the articulation of words, but you were almost like, I don't know if you were doing this intentionally or not, but I hope that you can replicate this because you were sort of slurring everything together, and it made it, you became like one stream, and it was, you were sort of enacting what you were writing about in sound, and I thought that was very interesting.
I can
And
replicate
you could
that.
feel that. I could feel it. Yeah, I kind of figured that, but like it's almost like, and that's where, for me, it became the moment where I mean, we know that you're acting up the poeticism of this thing as this like the Sisyphusian act of like moving this thing to this thing, but it's like your body's actually doing that while you're sort of trying to be didactic and explain this to people who may not understand that, which is in itself a huge feat. It's an effort, but like that moment when you could actually, when you know, it's like, we know that intellectually, but that was a moment when you could feel it, which I, you know, I think that that's pretty,
That's my favorite way to read too.
yeah.
Like if I'm reading out loud, I like reading like that because it feels like it keeps up with my mind a bit better.
Yeah.
But it also, yeah, I like the sound thing. It just, it has more of an interesting sound than when I'm just like speaking. You know, like what you were saying about like slurring together and the way that the words kind of shift. I like it a lot.
Can I ask you what it felt like to hold pages and play at the same time?
It was interesting because, and maybe it's because I've already done it once before, but it's like this kind of like balancing act almost. And it kind of like, what I really love about it is it gives my hands things to do. So like, I'm no longer worried during the performance about what my hands are doing, but I can just, I'm occupied, you know? And like, at a certain point, there's really not much of a differentiation between where I'm leaning each hand. It's just kind of like, oh, this is the paper, this is that.
Can I just, I'm aware it's almost one, and the first year guy's seminaries, he has a busy thing. So.
I have class at 1 too anyways.
I just wanted to let you know.
Yeah, anybody can leave whenever they want.
Hi. But you're fascinating to listen to.
I hope so.
Right.
Thank you guys listening. Thank you.
Thank you.